Hello class. Today we're going to talk about the public policy making process. And if we remember from earlier today or even yesterday, we talked about what public policy actually is. And we defined public policy as the decisions and non-decisions that the government makes. So when the government decides to pass a law, it's making a decision to do so. That law becomes public policy. Sometimes the government may decide to send troops overseas or not to send troops overseas. Those decisions are also public policy. So you're seeing here that policies are generally decisions or actions the government takes, or sometimes inaction, deciding to not do something. So our central question today is, how does our government decide what actions need to be taken? Where do they get their ideas to create public policies? And that's what this presentation is going to focus on. So public policy, first of all, is a cycle. It moves in a circle, and the circle starts always with the people. And you can see right here that this is where the policy-making process starts, which is right here with people. And we'll get to that in more detail in just a moment. But really what we're looking at here is that this is a process. Government doesn't just decide to take decisions or make decisions and just do stuff without really thinking through the decisions that they make. So it's important to know the government is, when they make their decisions, it actually takes a long time sometimes to follow through with this process. So the first step is people. So we're dissecting this diagram here, looking at this. You can actually find this diagram in your textbook when the book is actually finally issued to you. But you're seeing here that people right here is the very beginning of the process. People have ideas, people have problems, people have concerns, and they are voicing their concerns, and that's how this process of policy making actually starts. It always begins with the people. So their interests, you have sometimes people forming groups, and they have what we call special interests when they do that, and they're speaking up, and they're saying, and they're giving the government ideas. Once they give the government ideas, let's erase that, we can then move on to the next step of our public policy making process, which is linkage. Linkage really, and it's actually a very common word that's used in AP government, is this word linkage. It's the idea of connecting, that there is an institution, which is a group of people out there, and their job in our government is to simply connect the people to our government. So now this is the institution by which people voice their concerns. They voice their concerns, it gets picked up by a linkage institution. That institution then makes that concern well known to the government. So what is a linkage institution? It's a channel. It's some way that people can voice their concerns, and it's a way that people, when they voice their concerns, it's something that communicates those concerns to the government. So you want to think of a linkage institution as a connection instrument between the people and the government. So an example of a linkage institution is a political party. For example, people say, I want the healthcare policy, for example, more recent current stuff, passed. And they would voice that concern, obviously in this case, with something to the Democratic Party. And then that party puts that idea on their agenda. That's them linking those people's ideas to the government as the party is promoting that idea to the government as well. So another linkage institution is elections. People, when they vote, they're communicating to the government what they want. If they vote in favor of a lot of Republicans coming to office, they're saying that's a way of communicating to the government is through that election instrument. Also, news and entertainment media. When the news broadcasts, what they are showing, they're doing that to get ratings. And so they're showing stuff that they think people are interested in. So it's a good clue to the government, if it's on the news every night, that people are going to be interested in that. And then finally, an interest group, which kind of I mentioned earlier with a special interest. That's where you're really seeing people with common concerns coming together, and that interest group is a channel for those people to voice their special concerns. So now we're moving along the policy process like this. And we come here now to this next step, which is the policymaking agenda. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll see what the policymaking agenda is. Actually, once the linkage institution makes that policy or that issue or concern from the people well known, then those issues attract the attention of the public officials. So the agenda is actually the agenda of, and let's go ahead and highlight this. It's the agenda of public officials. And you want to make sure you remember that it's not an agenda of a linkage institution. It's not an agenda of the people. A policy agenda is actually, okay, now this is a serious concern. the linkage institutions really made this clear. We need to talk about this in our government. So let's talk about writing a law. Let's talk about making a decision that's maybe going to make some change with this policy. So it gets put on the agenda, and then there's obviously a lot of arguing and debate about how to fix it. And you want to make sure that not just because it's on the agenda doesn't mean it's going to happen. So sometimes things are heard, and sometimes things aren't. And also know that this is a regularly changing or a changing process, and that often the agenda is not a permanent thing, and that's what you're seeing right here. Okay. So now we're moving on to the next, which is where really a big focus is, which is where the policy actually gets made. So what we're looking at here is, I don't want to get rid of that. No, I can't get rid of that. Oh well. What we're looking at here is now moving to the policy making institutions. That's where we are in the next slide. So here we are, almost to the end of our policy-making process. The actual institution. The institution are generally the branches of government that make the decisions, that actually make the public policies. So you go from the people who have an interest, have a problem, have a concern. They voice their concerns. They talk about those concerns to the linkage institution. The linkage institution thinks, this might make some sense. We need to really put this on something that we talk about, on our agendas, on our platforms as well. And then once we make that really well and loud and clear, we then realize that government officials need to pay attention to this as well, which is putting this policy now on the government policy agenda, which you're seeing right here. And then once it's on the agenda, then it can get paid attention to by the policy-making institution. So an example of an institution, you always think about institutions, the three branches of government are policy-making institutions. The most simple public policy, obviously, we've talked about lawmaking. Who makes laws? Congress makes laws. Sometimes the president makes public policy decisions as well. Let's say that there's a concern about the way a regulation is being implemented in our executive branch, which is something we're going to talk about way later in the year. But there's a lot of executive controls that are under the control of the president, and so he can then make the changes with his institution as well. His institution being that executive branch, himself, and also the bureaucracy. He might also, we use the example of sending troops overseas as public policy. Sending troops overseas is an action made by the president himself. So there you're seeing public policy not just being in the action of law or in the form of laws, and you want to make sure it's really clear that you understand that. The courts, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, that becomes public policy. A really good example of a Supreme Court decision that is public policy, or that was public policy, is, let's go back to the pen, is, let's think about Brown versus Board. I'm just going to write Board here because I'm going to run out of space. So Brown versus the Board of Education is a really popular, or really well-known public policy decision made by the Supreme Court. And now, if you were in class right now, I'd ask you guys, what did that do? I'll give you a second to think about it, and hopefully you'll realize that Brown versus Board of Education, what that did is actually end school segregation in public education. So no longer could you separate students based on the color of their skin after that court case. That is a decision that was made, and let's take that back through the policy-making process. You had many people in the civil rights movement. We'll start right here with the people. You had many people say, hey, we think this is really unfair. In the civil rights movement, they made that very clear. They were right. It was very unfair. They voiced those concerns. The media picked up on it. Maybe a political party picked up on it as well. Definitely interest groups. The NAACP is your example of an interest group that picked up on it. It got put on the policy agenda because the courts decided we need to hear this case. Once the Supreme Court decided this case is a fair case to hear, we need to hear this because it's a problem in our government that started with the people, they then right here in the institution made that Supreme Court decision. And that's where you really see public policy being made. So then the next step, after the final institution of government that we'll talk about here, is bureaucracy. And that's a part of the executive branch. So actually executive and bureaucracy, those two things go together. And we'll talk about that more later on in the year as well. So now, once the once the policy-making institution acts upon the policy, they create that agenda. It, right here, all that says is it becomes public policy, which we see right here with the definition, is decisions and non-decisions made by the government. That policy comes into place. Once policies come into place, they start to affect the next step, which is the people. And that's where you get to this final step where you see public policy actually making a full circle affecting the people. In the case of Brown, sadly, there were people that didn't like that decision right away, and they voiced their concerns. The government didn't necessarily start back over into the cycle again, but they did actually hear and think about some other issues that came up with Brown. And so it's important to know that once policies are made, it's not final. It's never final in our government. That's what makes our government so interesting, is that policies continue to get written, rewritten, reviewed, and changed. And that always happens once the policy is actually made here. It then goes back, like I'm drawing the arrow here, to the people. It affects people. Either they love it. If they love it, my guess is the policy will stay the same. But if the people don't love it, then they'll voice their concerns right here, say, I don't think I like what I'm seeing, and go back into this process. So what you're seeing here is the act of making public policy, the act of making decisions in our government is one that is a circular process. It starts with the people, it ends with the people, and there's a lot of different players that are involved. So now I want to go back to our essential question, the very end of this. It's probably a quicker way for me to do this. So how does our government decide what actions to take and be taken? I want you to think about answering this question real quick, and think about the fact that, first of all, the government decides where does the process begin. That's the first way you can answer this question. And you guys should probably tell me. Hopefully you're thinking right now, speed up right now, because I know the answer. The answer is the process starts with the people. People communicate their concerns. Eventually those concerns get to the agenda of the government, and then the government makes decisions. And so you're seeing that the government has a very lengthy process of making public policy decisions. And that process tells them whether or not they want to act or not act, which, remember, again, is the definition of public policy. I want you guys to hopefully take good notes. Please review this if you have any questions. We're going to address our questions and comments about this process first thing in the morning when class begins. The other thing we're going to do is take some current event examples. I want you guys to think, what's a current event public policy that you guys have been focusing on? Maybe something you wrote about in your summer reading over the summer. And let's think about maybe how that public policy got made through this process, because we're going to actually take some current issues and walk them through the process like we did with Brown versus Board of Education. So again, if you have any questions, make sure you're writing them down so you don't forget them. Have a great night. Thank you, guys.